Welcome to the fourth of 8 brief discussions on the high leverage practices from the book Principles to Action. This is practice number 4, facilitating meaningful mathematical discourse. In this session, we'll define teaching practice 4 of the Principles to Action. We'll consider the best practices for teachers, and we'll connect practice 4 to the Danielson framework for teaching. I keep saying this comes from the book Principles to Action from the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, and that we're talking about practice 4. If you'd like to read through all 8 practices, you may pause this recording. While I keep talking about the book Principles to Action, the Idaho Mathematics Framework, instructional framework, is a modified version of the 8 high leverage practices. And for the sake of simplicity, they've just realigned the Idaho Mathematics Instructional Framework with the Principles to Action. And so for simplicity, I'm only going to refer to this framework now. Just know that it's connected to the research from that book. And I'm not sure why I keep emphasizing it other than to drive home the point that it is related to what National Math Thinkers, National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, that those who do research, it's all related to that, and that it's not necessarily just something that a couple of teachers sat in a room and were like, hey, let's do this. That it does come from some research and from some of our national forward thinkers. In order to get deeper into practice 4 of facilitating meaningful mathematical discourse, I'd like to show this diagram that represents how these practices tie together. In our last video, I discussed practice 3, using and connecting mathematical representations. It's important that we see and understand how these will all come together. For a teacher to be able to facilitate mathematical discourse, they'll need to utilize the other practices by finding tasks, posing questions, etc. For the purpose of this discussion, we'll discuss the umbrella that meaningful discourse involves, and some of the specifics will be included in the other videos on the other practices. So in just a moment, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and read the description from the book Instructional Leadership in Mathematics Education on facilitating meaningful mathematical discourse. As you read, consider the last slide and the picture here on the right that is what was on the last slide, and how the other high leverage practices are incorporated into this topic. Go ahead and pause the video and read the description. Press play when you're ready to continue. I showed this visual in the last video about using and connecting mathematical representations. Students should be able to make many connections to the math concept they are learning. When students are in groups where they can discuss these tasks, these different representations can manifest themselves through various levels of scaffolding. The teacher does not need to show or demonstrate each of these representations. They can facilitate students doing this work for other students as they work on given concepts. In every video, I like to try and put an example of math content and what we're talking about. I pulled this task from a textbook. The textbook's called College Prep Math, and this is their course 2, which is a 7th grade math. This gives an example of how students can have meaningful mathematical discourse. As I said, this is a 7th grade text. This has the objective of composing and decomposing numbers. Composing means putting numbers together, and decomposing means to break numbers apart. For example, I can decompose the number 15 into 10 and 5. I can break it apart into 2 numbers. Pause the video and read the task. Press play when you're ready to continue and discuss the task a little further. So this task is asking students to try different strategies. Number one, there are no strategies that they're posing, and that's a strength to this question. But they need to figure out how to get their tightrope walker 24 feet using only the lengths 2, 4, 8, and 10, or 17 feet, or 15 feet, or 27 feet. There's also more to this task, but I didn't want you to have to read through the whole lesson. And so in this, they're opening this a little bit to the students of try to figure this out. What are you going to use? What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? Later, the teacher can then come in and say, when you're adding those numbers, that's called composing. Or if you're going to subtract numbers off of 24 in the first example, that's called decomposing. That those kids can learn how to compose and decompose, and that there's not necessarily a right or wrong way on how to approach that. So this has the potential to have deep conversations, student to student conversations, through effective facilitation. I'd like to address a common myth about group discussions. And that myth is that some of the smart kids don't need to discuss the math because it will only frustrate them or slow them down. I'd like you to consider this quote from Jo Boaler, the author of Mathematical Mindsets. She says, "Often students have not learned to think deeply about ideas, explain their work, or see mathematics from different perspectives because they've never been asked to do so. When they work in groups with different thinkers, they are helped both by going deeper and by having the opportunity to explain their work, which deepens their understanding. Rather than groups being lowered to by the presence of low achievers, group conversations rise to the level of the highest thinking students." This means that high and low achieving students will benefit from meaningful math discussion. Education is not learned as an individual pursuit. It's not an individual endeavor. It's a communal endeavor. And I often, those students who are high level thinkers who can do the math really fast, they can't articulate what they're doing. They'll say, "Oh, I just did this." "Well, why did you do this?" "Oh, because that's what I'm supposed to do. I just did it." And being in a group will help them think about their thinking and what they were doing and why they were doing it, and it will deepen their understanding. Putting low achieving students with high achieving students is a good thing, not a bad thing. And it may frustrate high achievers because they've never been asked to think deeply about the math. This reminds me of the African proverb, "If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together." And that applies in this group discussion. So here are the components for domain 1 and 3 of the Danielson framework. If we consider where facilitating meaningful mathematical discourse would fall, one of the obvious choices would be domain 3 component B, using questioning and discussion techniques. Pause for a minute to consider where else this might fall in the Danielson framework. Press play when you're ready to continue. I'd also like to talk about, with the Danielson framework, domain 2. And the reason I would talk about domain 2 is because facilitating meaningful mathematical discourse does not happen without a strong domain 2. You can make good tasks and you can plan these tasks, but without domain 2 of cultivating respectful and affirming environments, fostering a culture for learning, maintaining purposeful environments, supporting positive student behavior, organizing spaces for learning, without strong domain 2 background, a teacher is going to really struggle with facilitating meaningful math discourse. This diagram is from the National Council of Supervisors of Mathematics book, Instructional Leadership in Mathematics Education. This shows the progression of facilitating meaningful discourse from teacher-centered to student-centered. Pause the video to read through, or maybe briefly scan this this progression and press play when you're ready to continue. I know there's a lot here, and it's more than we can discuss at this time. And that a part of that is because this practice is really the umbrella of the other practices. And so we could go all day about this, but we're not. It would be important that a teacher could see, and you as an administrator could see how or where a teacher could take next steps to progress from teacher-centered into student-centered. So this is the conclusion for this discussion. You can recall the diagram that I showed you at the beginning, and now maybe understand a little bit of why this meaningful mathematical discourse can be pretty complex, and that we really just can't talk about all the ins and outs of it today. The important ideas, there's a couple important ideas. One is that high and low achieving students will benefit from this. Another main idea is that a teacher will need to have strong domain 2 classroom management, classroom environment in order to do this. And the other main idea is that if you look on this on high leverage practice 2, implement tasks that promote reasoning and problem solving, it is really hard to facilitate meaningful mathematical discourse, deep mathematical discourse, where they're talking about concepts rather than procedures. It's really hard to do that without a curriculum or a resource where they can find tasks that will help them do that. Traditional textbooks will talk about procedure, and we've talked about that in previous videos. It's hard to have meaningful mathematical discourse if we're only going to be talking about the procedure and not the concept. So those would be our three main ideas for today. Strong domain 2 in Danielson. It helps high and low achieving thinkers, and that you need to have tasks that will help open the door for those students to work. So, as I mentioned, I'm only going to talk about the Idaho Mathematics Instructional Framework from here on out. And this concludes discussion number 4, Facilitating Meaningful Mathematical Discourse. As a reminder, this is the process for administrators in our accelerated learning program. We are now in December, and so there are 3 videos: high leverage practice 3, high leverage practice 4, and then there is a vision on visions and structures. In January, we will meet in person. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, please reach out to me. Thank you.